Okay. I've designed the session to run in like two parts. So this first part, we're just going to talk about what peer review for learning is, how it really helps learning. And then in the second part, we'll get on to, so now that we understand it, hopefully are motivated to try peer review, how to do it. Okay. The first distinction that we want to think about with peer review is the difference between peer review for learning as a very special kind of peer review and peer review in scholarship that as scholars we are familiar with, and making sure that that is a clean distinction that we can to frame the rest of this session. Peer review in general is what happens very naturally in many spaces and more formally in other spaces, learning from a peer observer's feedback. So in scholarship, we think of it as gatekeeping, it's filtering, there's a focus on a certain quality of product. And, you submit a manuscript, you get some feedback with accept, reject, revise, and resubmit. It's pretty one way. And then you move on, and we really learn from that process. It sharpens us. Peer review for learning has a little bit of that, but it's not gatekeeping. It's not only the sharpening of a final product, but there's an equal focus on the learning process. A lot of learning how to learn happens. And therefore, it's definitely dialogic. It's two-way, sometimes multi-way. You can do it with groups. It's part of collaborative learning, right? So it's a method of taking the learning process right into integration with an assessment process. So here's a definition: guided dialogic feedback process, and we'll really talk about that guided part that is critical. Explicit criteria and a very explicit and shared goal. Why are we doing this? And how are we going to do this? What is the ultimate outcome we want from it? And that is very, very much part of the setup process for peer review. It is also another way to understand peer review is that it transforms assessment into something that is an explicit formative process that's integral to learning. So the notion of community is so important for peer review. Before we move on, I'm just curious, how many of you use peer review in your classrooms? If you use it, what subject are you using it in? If you would like to share in chat, that would be really great, right? Any form of peer review. And then as we go through, you'll see how varied peer review can be. But I'm curious to know if anyone's been playing around with peer review at all. Okay. Thank you, Heather. Not yet. Yeah, peer review. This is why I feel that, today we are beginning to explore how to do it well. It's a bit of a process. It's very popular, yes, in English. Qualitative research methods, that's fantastic. It's really good in developing a researcher mind. Great, thank you for sharing. So now I'm going to, in the next part, talk about benefits before we get into the how and talk about how does it work well? Yeah, Kendall, you're saying the same thing. It doesn't work as well as we might have hoped. And we'll get into why and then how to address that. But one of the why of peer review, like why should we bother, right? And it really is because it is a wonderful way to be very inclusive to a diversity of learners. So just to kind of remind ourselves and get ourselves on the same page, think about this for a moment. If you have the white space encourages you to just think openly and freely. What are all the differences our students embody that could be barriers to flourishing in our courses, right? Feel free to share in chat. but also don't worry about it. Just think about it. Think about all the students who walk into your room. They're all so different, right? Different needs, different expectations, different lives. They embody so much that just could become, in an unintended way, a barrier to them flourishing. So here are some. What people embody as they come in, different languages and fluencies, not just fluency in the language of instruction, but also fluency in the discourse of your discipline, different work styles, different learning cultures, depending on where they come, absolutely full-time or part-time jobs. So that whole life thing, they're juggling all of these responsibilities. So they might be challenged with time, energy, focus. There's also the hidden curriculum for disciplinary expectations. I remember when I worked at the Writing Center, people would come in and say, I have to write a lit review and I haven't the foggiest, right? Because I'm shifting my discipline from this to this and I don't know what is expected. So all of these things can get in the way of just this flourishing and learning that we want them to go through. Confidence, age, yeah, that's the whole sort of emotional, affective part of learning too that people generate. And in the green box, you just see just some of the types of students, and many students embody more than a few of these in one, right? And what you're going to see next, I'm going to show you 4 different big areas of positive outcomes for peer review in class. As you go through, since we've just been where we're thinking about our students, the audience of our learning and teaching. As we go through these areas, think about those students, think about your students, and think what student is really helped, what barriers are really removed by each of these outcome areas. So the first thing I want to show you is just this first model. What we do, the positive outcomes of peer review for learning, what we do is we're making a little shift or transformation from assessment to judge learning, which is what many students come in with. That's how they think of it too. The teacher is the jury and the judge of my work, and I am a passive performer. We're going to shift that, change the paradigm for our students to assessment that supports learning, where the teacher is facilitator and students actively co-create the learning with the teacher and each other and improve. And the 4 areas that peer review will address will be these 4: assessment clarity, metacognition, and learning how to learn, formative, safe, fail learning space, and co-creation and building a learning community. We'll go through each one in turn very briefly and keep thinking of your students as we go through. Who is it helping? How does it help you as a teacher? Right? And what barriers in general of learning come down when we do this? So assessment clarity. This is probably, as you'll see also in some of the research I'll share with you in a bit, where sometimes peer review can fail, right? But if students have explicit criteria to review each other's work, then what we're doing is taking away the mystery, right? All the expectations are explicitly stated. So if there is any kind of a difference by students coming in from different backgrounds and disciplines, all of that is leveled out because we're making everything explicit. There are no hidden assumptions. We're telling them very explicitly again, and with opportunities to clarify understanding. When this happens, then students are better equipped to have more agency in improving their work. Now, of course, all of these can be done without actually formally doing peer review. And that's the wonderful thing about this topic that I love, that you can take these principles and outcomes and ask, how am I already doing it in some other way? Okay? But this is definitely one of the benefits of peer review. It creates this explicitness around an assignment. Okay. And of course, I invite you again, if you have any thoughts, questions, a yes and or something to what I'm saying, please share in chat, because you can bring all your work that you're currently doing into this conversation. But we'll go on to the next one. This one is huge. One of the big benefits of peer review is that there is intentional guidance to examine the deep structure, right? The content, how it's structured, the structure of an assignment, the processes of doing an assignment. These are all looked at intentionally, explicitly, in a facilitated way. And when we provide a structured process to think analytically about the work, when we create and dedicate space to students creating and exchanging strategies to improve learning, and when we signal to them with this focused time and space that we are stopping to pay attention to work quality, then you are building more than a good assignment. You're actually preparing them for the future. They're developing self-awareness, they're developing skills as learners. So to Kendall and Heather's comments earlier, sometimes the peer review is messy, but the learning might actually be a little deeper than if they didn't do it, right? Students have more self-efficacy. They feel like, I know now how to fix some issues, right? So this is peer review done well. This is the big payoff. And here's a little piece from the research. The peer review done well and that metacognition piece, right, leads to a couple of things. One, feedback is no longer as scary. That's a big, big scholarly skill and a big life skill. We only sharpen through feedback. And then the work, they actually produce a better work product. So these are quotes from these different research studies where the students are talking about the impact on them, what they got out of it. I learned how to receive feedback without being close-minded. Looking at someone else's work caused me to evaluate my own approach, justified my reasons for working in this way. It's easy to spot mistakes in that distancing that the student experienced, and I can see the work clearly, and then I can bring it back to apply to my work. And in a lot of studies, the giver of the reviewer actually is where the gains are happening, as not so much the person receiving the feedback. So that's really interesting, right? In creating the process to help people learn how to basically do analytical thinking on their own work. So this is another area where there's a big benefit, and this helps so many learners, especially those who are coming in new to something. It's a safe fail concept. It's a space where errors are actually something we're looking at, talking about, discussing without anybody being spotlighted. It's formative because we're learning how to fix the errors. And the notion of drafting errors, feedback, revision is incredible because it really does develop the growth mindset. Like, I know not knowing doesn't make me less than. Not knowing means I have to look for strategies. Comment in chat. In using peer review, students become more comfortable with their own writing. Yeah. And you do, each assignment is a slightly different one. With writing, and I would expand that, thank you for sharing that, I would expand that to any subject, to become more comfortable with your own scholarly voice in any discipline. In doing peer review, you are seeing and hearing other voices, and then you are beginning to find your own. So it is a very, very formative space. And if we make space for asking questions and seeking clarification as part of peer review, without spotlighting anyone, then there's also this learning that happens. Like, questions are not a bad thing to ask. It doesn't signify that I'm, like one student said, I feel like if I ask a question, people will think I don't know anything, right? But we want to normalize asking questions. We want to normalize making errors and struggling, because that is part of sharpening and growing. Right. So this is one of the big sort of both the affective and cognitive impact that happens with peer review. It changes how students think about assessment and work. And the final one is the learning. I'm pausing here to find a different word, but maybe the best is creating community. Right. But in a different sense, like creating a really learning, working community, a collaborative community is what I was looking for. Yeah. Where by creating time and space for peer review, you are signaling also that we care to help each other, that nobody needs to be isolated in the learning process. And it's not just teacher-learner isolation. It's now we can share learning, and we value learning as a community process. Now, that's another value that students can walk away with, to say, this is how you actually do good work in the world, right? As a scholar, as a practitioner, you go out there and you collaborate to learn. And peer review is collaborative problem solving. And it's a really good, attitude to foster. And the high stakes, even if the assignment itself might be, worth a lot, in the drafting revision process, the high stakes become non-threatening, because we know we have time and space to revise, help each other, and create something good. Khalida said, I have questions at the end of every paper that helps. Yes, exactly. And we'll maybe when we get to the how to do it part, I'd like you to share a little bit more of that, because how we structure the thinking is going to make the difference between an effective peer review that really hits these 4 outcomes and something that might be confusing to students, right? You really need to guide their thinking. Most of the time, I think it's because peer review is not a big prevalent practice yet everywhere. For many students in your class, it might be the first time they're doing it, right? So that guidance is really important. Okay, before we get into the how, just in this survey of the benefits, are there any other thoughts or questions? You are free to unmute yourself and speak, or put it in chat. Any puzzles, new ideas I haven't shared with you that you'd like to share, different perspectives on this?
Yes, I find it interesting that because when I think peer review, as a student, I think that it's going to affect my grade.
Mm-hmm.
And this kind of eliminates that, where it's kind of like, where it's more about sharing, opposed to someone's going to say, or I'm going to write that so-and-so didn't help in the group project or whatnot, which is what it seems like it kind of turns to, at least in my undergraduate experience.
Right.
It was, peer review was only for kind of saying who did what on a group project.
Right. And
opposed to sharing what went well or what I could have done different on an assignment in general.
And that's really, I'm so glad you said that, because that is where you make the distinction, right, as you design peer review and guide students in it. So that review was not so much peer review for learning, that was student assessment, right? The students are assessing themselves. And that's fine, there's a place for that, peer review for learning. So if you could do both, right? But through the project, there might be a peer review moment where you talk about, let's look at everybody's work, what's working, where are the gaps, what's the problem, how do we fix it? That's peer review for learning. And everyone is reviewing each other's input or contributions and so on. And then at the end, you might do a peer assessment. So yeah, I'm glad you brought it up. So those are the kinds of distinctions we want to start thinking about as we get into this section on process and facilitation. So,
I have a comment.
yeah, please.
I didn't mean to interrupt you, but
No, please, Khalida, go on.
for every essay I do, I have one essay I will focus only on grammar, because I think students are so scared of grammar. And at the end of last 2-3 questions I have, I'll ask them, okay, so they ask their peers, what did you learn from my assessment? And where are you going to take this in the future? And how did the grammar practice help you? The next one I'll do on, say, about images.
Right.
About English literature or 1B. And I'll tell them, think about the essay and tell the peer what was going on in your head moment to moment. What are you thinking about? And so they have to write it all down. And at the end of every peer review, I have students conference with one another, and then we talk about it in class. I found that very helpful. I got it from various resources like teachers' manuals and this manual. And so I just totally believe in peer reviews. I think it is the best way of assessing students for themselves, not me,
right?
But the students. So I really like this. I like what you're doing here.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing. And see what you're doing, and I think you might recognize it as we go through this next part, is you're chunking it, breaking it down, and then you're scaffolding the conversation and the discussion. So you're not just saying, go give each other feedback, right? There is a structure to it, and that has made your peer reviews very successful. And that's one of the essential, necessary parts of designing good peer review. But I just want to, before we jump into the actual process, where do you do peer review? What kinds of things can you peer review? And it doesn't have to be an entire big paper. That's a tradition. You have a whole paper and you review. But you can, especially when you have a tight schedule, you have a big class, or students are so new to the process, I call it edging in. Don't jump in with a big piece. But also peer review is really great and quite fun to bring into all kinds of assignments or even just work, right? So it could be a proposal in the narrative type of assignments. It could be just the outline. Let's peer review our outline. So before they go to the trouble of writing a whole thing, let's just look at argument structure in an outline. Right? That's a more structured place to peer review, probably very successful. Maybe they're writing blogs, or maybe it is a paper. Peer review in a research space. So if someone's designing surveys in a lab, in my undergrad, we actually did a lot of this kind of thing and didn't call it peer review, but that's what it is. That the different survey research teams design their survey, but then we do that review of each other's surveys and give each other feedback. Really learn to think metacognitively about the why of our survey questions, right? Interview protocols, data analysis, planning documents, how people write up and communicate the result. Excuse me. Each part of any research process could be broken down into a moment. As long as there's something being produced, it can be broken down into that moment to pause, stop, and with a set of good guiding questions, review and decide what are the action steps to improve it. Performance, if anyone here is doing any kind of performance-based work with their students, peer review is also about observing and then having a dialogue about what's going on and giving each other feedback. So in the arts, the crit is a dreadful, a fearful thing, because that's really a criticism. But you can make it more peer review, learning oriented. Debates, you can do debates and then peer review what happened, right? So at this point, you're thinking, well, peer review is just giving feedback. Yeah, it is. It is giving feedback to each other as peers, but when it's guided and structured well, then there is this huge learning that happens. Okay, so something, and I think both Heather and Kendall spoke to this earlier, common issues with peer review. Students lack confidence in giving feedback, or They don't trust their peers' feedback. The teacher is the only person who really knows everything. There's a lot of uncertainty, or it seems like a waste of time, right? And so much research has looked at this phenomenon in peer review. And the response to that in other research, or sometimes in the same study, is that what makes a difference is structure, preparation, practice if possible, and explicit sharing with students of the why, how it's going to help them. So I have a model for you. Here's a peer review model based on active learning. Input. In active learning, we talk about input, then the doing, usually the students, and then some sort of check for understanding, but in this case, I'm calling it consolidate. Input is you, the teacher, really designing it. It may be a heavy lift at first, but trust me, right? Once you've designed it well, you can just modify and just keep using it, right? The first go around is a little heavier. But what are my instructions to my students? I have in my resource slide, in this slide deck, a template that you could use, and then you can modify it for yourself. Is there a checklist for review? If you have a rubric for the assignment, use the same rubric for the review. Do you model it? Practice, right? Student do is where they actually do the work. And we'll go through each of these in turn. I put it into a visual so that that's an easy reminder. But let's look at input. You want to tell in the instructions for peer review, and you can use the template we provide, but essentially it is telling students what it is. Remember, they probably haven't done it or have a different conception of it. Why we do it, how it's going to help them, and how we will do it in this assignment, in this class. So you have to really spell that out, right? Then you can replicate this for further peer reviews. Your rubric or checklist, you should be giving it with the assignment. It's the same checklist for the peer review. So they're using it to kind of like a compass to see if they're on the right track. And you will use it for the final grading of the assignment. Because of this, and you may want to come back to PFF and talk about rubrics and checklists, a single point rubric where it's really a checklist of items that is spelled out really clearly helps. One of the benefits of doing peer review for the teacher is you will soon hear from your students that your criteria are not clear. And so it'll help you to clarify your criteria. And then modeling in practice is ideal if you have time, like maybe just take 10 minutes and demonstrate how to use the checklist on a sample assignment, or have them all practice on just a small paragraph or something. But the more you can model and practice, the better. Something in the research, peer review gets better, the benefits are significantly increased the more a student does it, right? So rather than doing one big peer review, do a couple of small little ones that'll help the assignment, but also really help the students learn how to learn. Now, the student do part, there are multiple variations on this, but this is the most common pattern for effective peer review. There is a space and a time to look at each other's work on their own, using that checklist before the peer review session in class, or sometimes some teachers dedicate some part of the class session to looking at the peers' work. Depends on time. And then you annotate the checklist and you're looking for errors, you're looking for gaps, you're looking for areas for clarification, and you're giving ideas for improvement. These are 4 categories. Teachers change these and have their own, but these are the rough 4 areas that are helpful to students. And then once that's been done, you enter into conversation. One-on-one, small group, you take turns. That should be facilitated. Don't give excuses for your work, just listen if you're receiving reviews. So you have to sort of structure that a little bit. And really teach students that excuses and reasons, they're fine, but they just take up time and waste focus, right? What we're looking for is to identify something and polish it, change it, improve it. And then as a whole class, it's always helpful then to come back and say, what did we all learn from this? It kind of feeds the metacognitive process. What I love to do is when they're doing peer review, I have a shared document, a wiki page, a cloud, or I even use Jamboard, where they can just put Post-its. It's all anonymous. And if they have questions coming out of this peer review and they're like, yeah, we don't really understand what is meant by cogent argument, they can pop that question up there. And then I get to look at what's coming up and address some of those questions. I have also found that about 50% of the questions that the different pairs put up can be answered by other students. So they start teaching each other as well. It's really quite rich. And this can go on beyond the peer review session into an assignment exchange space. I love Canvas for that. It can go into a discussion tool so people can still help each other beyond the peer review moment, right? And then consolidation is important. We do a good peer review, but sometimes it really, really helps to have students locked down. It's like when we end a meeting. We had a great conversation, but let's walk away with some action items. So what 3 to 5 things am I going to do to revise this assignment? And then I usually ask them a couple of learning questions. What did you learn about yourself? What strategies do you think are most important for you? What questions do you still have? You can change those reflection questions to suit the assignment. But it's really important that they get this moment, this chance. Sometimes I try to at least get this started in the session. If they don't finish it, it's fine. And I say it's due in Canvas by the end of the week. So for me as a teacher, I love to see what their action items are, because sometimes I realize there is a pattern that tells me something about how I designed the assignment. That wasn't clear enough. Sometimes I see where problem areas are and I can reach out and help students. And I really like to know how they are thinking about themselves as learners. It teaches me a lot about my own teaching. There is a template for this in the resource slide that you're very welcome to use, alter, modify, and to what you need for your classes. So those are the three sections: input, student do, consolidation. And I'm bringing us back to this model from assessment to judge learning, which has its space. But for learning and developing learning, we want to use peer review for assessment to support learning, where we facilitate the collaborative process. If you walk away with these 3 principles, structure and guidance, critical, really, really critical. Give students agency and opportunity to lead their learning. So the collaborative space and the sharing of strategy is very powerful. It also is a huge motivator when students start working with each other and helping each other. And for both the student's sake and the teacher's sake, in terms of, edging in, start small and build. Because peer review, when you start thinking about it and designing it, seems like a heavy lift. And it is. It's a teacher and student actively collaborating in improving the work. It's not easy, but it is actually easy if you start small, right? So just edging in gently, and it'll help students who have never done it before. Many students who've done it before might have had a bad experience. So you really want to make this, change it into something really helpful. And this is just a slide that puts it all together. Here is the model. Here are the 4 areas of positive impact, and a reminder of all the different students who come into the space to do the work and could gain from all of these positive outcomes. And then the resources. So there are 2 templates that you're very welcome to use. The online writing lab, at Purdue University. I highly recommend it. It's a fantastic resource for all kinds of things. They also have incredibly good peer review set of guidelines. Oh, I like Kelly's comment. Yeah. With the same peer review partner, I think that is so great because you are amplifying the notion of a safe fail space, right? This is your learning partner through a semester. It's a beautiful idea. And then these two videos were really designed, it's from Virginia Tech. It was really designed, it's talking directly to the students, very short videos, what it means to be a peer reviewer, how to write effective peer review comments, good examples in it. And you can use it as a resource for your own students, or you could build off it to develop your own instructions. Everything else that follows is, I have, if you want to go down the rabbit hole of the research on it, by all means do that. And I would love to, we have a good amount of time. I'd love to have you just ask general questions. I'm going to end the slide sharing for now. Holly has a poll for you that she will launch. So please take the poll. We need the feedback. But while, I shared just a simple model of peer review, the benefits of peer review, ideas for how you do it. But if you're implementing peer review, do you have any questions that come immediately to mind, especially the troubleshooting kind of questions that we can all work on together, where it's gone wrong, trepidations that you have? Yeah, Kendall.
Is it okay to just shout out a question?
Yeah. It's a small group.
Okay.
Let's just unmute and talk.
Okay, I hesitated to ask the question because I thought it might be a little specific, but if others don't have questions, maybe you can share some thoughts. As you know, I'm really interested in trying out ungrading this year. And I was thinking a lot about incorporating peer review as a component of ungrading. And I just wondered if you had any specific suggestions or recommendations or advice. I mean, I feel like I have some terrific ideas after your presentation, so thank you so much for that. But if you had any other suggestions, thoughts, resources, things I should think about in terms of incorporating peer review into an ungrading class.
So that's like a magic combination. People who do ungrading do that because if you just broaden the notion of peer review, it's collaborative learning. And peer review has a huge component of assessing the work, right? Then if you're doing ungrading, then you've already lowered the stakes for them in terms of I have grade anxiety, and you incorporate peer review however you want to, small pieces, a big project or whatever, as part of the assessment, the self-assessment students are doing. So you're doing peer assessment. And if you're doing ungrading and you're helping them to always be self-assessing rather than the teacher assessing, then you fold it in so well in the consolidation part because they can do a journal entry or they can write into a worksheet. How did this help me? Is my work improving? So it can be easily part of ungrading. By the way, for those for whom the term ungrading is new, it is a whole area of pedagogy where we reduce grade anxiety because a lot of the research shows that grades have an inverse relationship to learning. So we reduce grade anxiety by taking away, especially in the interim process of a course, any grading actually, right? The teacher doesn't grade. The teacher might be giving a lot of feedback, but it's not attached to a grade. This is also part of the logic of if someone is a novice, the early work is going to be horrible, probably, right? But then when you do the grade calculation, this counts for 10%. And so it impacts the final grade, whereas by the final, they might be really great at it. So ungrading, especially the middle to beginning part of your course. Some people ungrade the whole course. Some colleges, like I think Bennington College is one, don't have grades. They have portfolios. But if you do assign grades at the end, you can still ungrade the early part of the work so that students are focused not on, oh my gosh, I got to do this to get my grade, but they'll do it because they're learning. That's another webinar for another time, like what is ungrading, right? And what about questions like, but if I don't give them points or grades, they won't do the work. There is research that says that it's a risk you take, but actually the trend is they actually want to do the work. So yeah, Kendall, it totally is a blend. We can talk more about it. I know you're ungrading your course.
Yeah. Well, and I actually feel like peer review fits particularly well because I think in some ways it's one more motivation for students to do really good work because they're going to be sharing it with their peers. And even though it's assessment for learning and not for a grade, I still think most students want to kind of put their best foot forward when they feel like my peers are going to look at this and they're not looking at it to tear it apart, but I still want to put my best foot forward. So to me, it seems like a natural fit.
You're right. It's like a little mini performance. That's why you keep it informal and in class, but I'm going to perform it. Performing for your peers is harder than for a stranger or a judge. You're right. There's a lot of motivation. And the thrill that you get to do your work collaboratively. I'm not alone, right? And when you think of the diversity of learners who come in and the different problems and issues they have, this really supports a learning space for them.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Brian put something, this question might be a little beyond the scope of this meeting, but does anyone have experience with peer review in an asynchronous class? Oh, lovely question. What does anybody have to say? Has anyone tried peer review asynchronously?
I think I might have, but so I have discussion boards where I have students, I call them check-ins, but they kind of discuss what went well with an assignment, what they could have done better, and what strategies or resources they used to aid them in creating the assignment. At the community college I teach at, they have to do child observations and they have multiples that they need to complete. So having them do a check-in and discuss what went well with one another can carry on to the next assignment. Also, because it's community college and I have a lot of students that work or are parents, etc. I also have them go through and kind of talk about what their plan is for getting their assignment turned in on time. Great. And I've seen them come up with some really great ideas that they've used or resources they used, and they'll talk back and forth on these discussion boards about, the tutoring, the free tutoring was great, or I messaged, me and I talked them through it, or etc. So I think discussion boards usually go really well.
Discussion boards are good. And what you're doing there, Kelly, a lot of it is very much the strategy sharing. So it's resourcing each other and also reflection on learning. Have you ever tried them actually asynchronously looking at each other's actual work?
Not asynchronously, but in-person classes, like you said on one of the slides, like do a sample. So I have them observe one another playing. And that's great. I watch kids, right? So they observe each other playing with a toy.
Right.
With their least dominant hand, so it's a little awkward. And they have fun with that, but then I have them look at each other's observations, and then I put what should be on the board so they can kind of like look at the board and then doing that before they go watch the kids. Yeah, that's really integrating peer review in a very creative way. That's great.
Something else. So I want to respond to Brian's question as well. Cindy said discussion forum asked them to discuss about the reading and respond to at least 2 classmates. That would be, but you can apply the same thing to each other's work. So depending on which learning management system you use, and this is why these LMSs are great, but I know Canvas allows you to assign peer review, right? And I know Blackboard does that. I don't know about the other ones, but you can assign peer. So everyone's written something, could be an outline for something, and then you assign, they submit it in the assignment, and then you can assign peer review and pair people up. And with who shared it earlier, if you've already established review partners or learning partners for the whole course, then it just becomes part of the culture of your teaching. At some point, those learning partners are going to read each other's work. And then you can use the discussion board to have an open session, but in the assigned peer review, they can also give each other direct feedback. But here's the thing that I know from my own practice and that I've seen in all the research. The one-to-one feedback is essential. So whether you do it synchronously or asynchronously. But what is important to remember in the asynchronous space is the conversation piece is also important. So if your class is totally asynchronous, Brian, then what I've done, so I used to teach for Open University and it was all online because it was global, right? We would set up, back in my day, we didn't have wonderful things like Zoom. We would set up, the most advanced technology was like Skype or WebEx. But the students I had them in groups, and they were permanent groups. After they'd done the peer review asynchronously, they would meet on Skype or WebEx or whatever and have a conversation to share strategies. And that's where I would use the shared wiki document that they could all put questions in. So you can kind of break this up in an asynchronous way, as long as there's principles of the one-to-one followed by sharing. Any other questions or comments? And I would love to know, yes, Heather. Oh, you're muted.
I have kind of an unpleasant question.
Good.
So when I have taught statistics, I have urged the students to work together in groups because there's a lot of research that shows that people learn particularly quantitative material better if they work together in groups. But I have also stressed to them that when they turn in their assignments, they need to provide credit for the people who did the work. So if it's collaborative, that's fine, but then they need to say, on this problem, so-and-so helped me, or I got this answer from so-and-so or whatever, so that there's still, because we still do have the whole issue of intellectual property. And, as scholars, we have to give credit for the people from whom we got our ideas. But this has not always worked well. In fact, even though I've been very clear about both that I encourage it, but that also that they have to state, who they're working with and how they're doing it. Sometimes they don't. And then there, in essence, is kind of a cheating problem in the class, even though I've been very clear about this. Does this happen? I mean, I admire very much the notion that we should be encouraging students to learn collaboratively, especially because, as you pointed, I suppose this depends on your field, but in my field, increasingly the research is done in teams. It's not done with the individual scholar in the ivory tower. You've got to work. The work is too complicated. People have different expertises that you're bringing together. So I think that's great, but there also does have to be some kind of a recognition if your ideas came from someone else or somewhere else. Is this an issue that arises in this?
It's sometimes in straight up peer review, no, because they're not actually producing a work.
Right.
They're getting
Right.
feedback and then they got us to,
That's
that's right. It's giving each other that feedback and also giving each other some strategies. Oh, have you ever used this model for writing an argument? And they share. So it doesn't come up so much in that peer review space. But what you're talking about with the collaborative learning is I don't know, do you have a structured space in which they have to actually put down names of who helped them or something like that? that they have
Uh,
to submit, you know?
Well, they have to turn in a homework and they're supposed to write it on there, but
Yeah,
there's not a structured space. No, it's just turning in your work. And I
right.
told them, if if you are working with someone else, put that on there. But no, I
Mm.
don't have a structured space.
One way to nip that in the bud is actually intentionally make them work in collaborative groups that you've defined or that they've defined. So A, B, C, D, you're in one group. And after every homework, they have to say what each person contributed to the work. So it's just, there are four of us in a group, and Heather did a lot of the troubleshooting on this problem, and Shamini did, came up with a nifty shortcut. And they just have to write something for each person, and each person must have a contribution. Otherwise, there's a problem. And if there's a pattern, then, that's a conversation with the group to say, why is Shamini doing all the work? Or why is nobody doing the work? Because the homework materializes, but responsibilities are not there. And it's like, take responsibility for your contribution. And that puts a really positive spin on it. Right.
Oh
What
boy.
if one of the group members complains about others and copied the student dean on this? Oh, then you need to take it yourself somewhere else. So if the first you hear of it is when the dean contacts you, this is why in teaching, I believe so much, just like in research, in documentation. If your process is clear to you, and you've made that process clear to students, then there's a paper trail of some sort. So Cindy, can you clarify, is this in peer review rather than just the collaborative learning? If the group members complain about the other group members, is that part of peer review?
I actually do give peer review because I'm teaching data visualization. So a lot of it is basically taking, let's just say, an example of a collection of data visualization from
Mm-hmm.
quantitative study, and I ask them, hey, what would you do different?
Mm-hmm.
I put them in the group first week of the school, and then I will still have complaints to saying, hey, I'm work with so goals and different exercises. You are graduate students. You're not going to be guaranteed that you're going to be paired up with everybody and work together. They know each other. At the end of the semester, they still had a while. So,
It
and I'm
happens.
like, let's work on this. Your instructor, I want you two guys to hold each other's hand and help each other. I'm also there's a sheet. What did you do? Did you help other with anything? So that way, I take scores. I actually do have an individual contribution that I can use to
Cindy, you're breaking up. It's really hard to hear you.
Yeah, sorry, I'm probably in a bad area, but
Okay.
what if one of the students, after you work with them and still not happy with the group and basically said, well, I've already talked to my instructor does this. If
Mm.
I'm not satisfied with it, I'm gonna go to the student dean. I have that going on right now, and I'm here going, well,
That's something, I would say come in and talk with the PFF team about that, because this is bigger. It is sort of like group dynamics are one of the hardest things to handle, in whether it's in a workplace, it's even harder in the
I called it
classroom.
out to my student dean and the department chair. I'm like, I'm willing to work with them in any way that I possibly can, but your semester is going to end in about a month, so it's kind of late to switch groups.
Yeah, and at this point, I think, this conversation is now beyond peer review, but it's interesting. And we can stay on and chat a little bit more later after this, Cindy. But also realizing that what the teacher and the school sees is a small part. There are entire whole lives going on with the students. There may be many, many factors that contribute to the student feeling so bad and feeling so conflicted with somebody else that it's not always, you take it all on as an educator, but you also have to realize there's a huge bigger picture to talk about here. If that student had previous experiences that are horrible, they're coming in, like this, and it's not conducive to collaboration. So it might be the wrong time for them to be in a group. You don't know about microaggressions that are going on, and those are both intentional and unintentional, usually unintentional. So many possibilities that students might not even be conscious of.
Yeah.
So a part of it is, looking again, and the big learning from this for all of us is when anything like that happens, what I do is I go back to how did I design the whole team process?
Okay.
How did I set it up so that you pay it forward? This may be a situation where it just has to be what it is.
Okay.
Right. So we can keep talking about it. We have just 3 minutes. If anybody wants to share something else, ask a question. Heather, by the way, it wasn't an unpleasant question at all. It was a very important one.
Thank you.
This is a kind of forum where I feel like it ought to be safe for us to ask those questions and talk about these things. So thank you for asking that. But if anyone has anything else about peer learning, broadening that term out, learning with your peers.
I guess I'll just say as a student, I enjoy getting those interactions, especially during most of my schooling at CGU has been through Zoom because of COVID. And now we're back in person, so I appreciate it more.
Oh, and thanks for saying that. Just because we're back in person, all these beautiful strategies that we use to liven up Zoom, please don't forget them. We can still use them. The collaboration that happened because we had to pivot online and we found ways to be connected with each other, I think that was wonderful. We can keep that going. Okay, I'm going to be hanging out here for a few more minutes if anyone wants to stay. Holly, do you want to launch the poll? And please give us feedback on the poll. And once you've taken the poll, if you're free to go. And I just want to say, having come to this peer review thing and broadened out the conversation to peer learning, I would love it if you would intentionally try a few things out and then come back and tell us how it went, right? Or come back and troubleshoot with us, or come back and design the peer review process with us. We're all happy to help. Okay, so everyone's done the poll. Okay, all right, well, have a great afternoon, rest of the day. And if I don't see you, the rest of the summer.
Thank you.
Bye.
I guess if you said you might be hanging out, I do just have one last question.
Sure, absolutely.
So you mentioned specifically that one of the problems is that the students don't have confidence in their own ability to give comments. And I think when I try to think about why, when I tried it, it didn't work well, I think that was perhaps, it's a little hard to tell, but perhaps that was the key issue. What can you do to convince the students otherwise?
One of the things that I do that really helps, well, if you give them very clear, so giving them like almost like a worksheet helps them with the confidence. It's just a little scaffold. So if I have a rubric, and I used to use these analytical rubrics, the usual grid, I break it out into like a checklist. It's less daunting. And so I have, like 10 things to look out for. And I also sometimes, if it was like when I used to do it, when I taught writing, I would only focus the peer review on something like, I just want to look at argument and evidence. So I'll give them 4 things to look for. Is there an assertion? What's the evidence? Is the evidence through logic, or is it through factual evidence, etc.? I have these 4 or 5 things. And part of the confidence building is that they can spot it and go, it's a yes/no question. And then if it's a no, what should that person do? Give some advice. That seems to help a lot with confidence. It's like training wheels. The second time I do it more loosely. So you all know what to look for now. We're looking at argument. Here's the rubric. Talk to each other. The first couple of times I did peer review also, I went through the letting them practice, and then we pulled it up on the screen and we peer reviewed the peer review comments as a whole class. It was anonymous, so we were like, let's have at it. And they said, yeah, they should have said more about what to do, and they are coming up with really good strategies. So that's something. And this is why I say it's not an easy thing to do, but it's so worth it. If you do a small piece, say in the early part of the course, they're ready to do a substantive piece 3/4 way through and for a big assignment. If you're going to try it again, let me know how it goes.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah.
See you later.
See you. Bye.
Bye.